And when I was in undergrad, I was out photographing with a visiting artist who's a South Korean photographer, Taewon Jang. And he did a whole book called Stained Ground, where he's photographing different industrial sites throughout the world, often at night with this kind of glow and atmosphere. Yet when we went out to Sinclair, Wyoming, we like pulled off just on the edge of like the public property outside of one of these refineries. And within like 10, 15 minutes, we had the Sinclair PD, the Highway Patrol, the Sheriff's Department, all on us. I think there was like 13 guys in total that responded to us just having a camera set up like on the edge of the property line. And they were just telling us, oh, the company doesn't want you here. You need to leave. And we're like, well, it's public property. Legally, do we have to leave? And they're like, well, legally you don't, but the company doesn't want you here. Like, and they, that kind of rhetoric. And they all end up kind of leaving. We stay on the edge of the property line to kind of make these long exposures at night. And eventually the head of security pops out like on this golf cart. And he's just telling us like, yeah, this is why I love the night shift. Isn't it just beautiful? And I'm like, we just go through all of this with the law enforcement thinking that we're here to do something that like puts their town at risk. And then here's the person who's in charge of security who kind of gets why we're there at night. So for me, I find like trying to promote those dialogues really beneficial. Yeah, so I have kind of a handful of images from a series called Hinterland. Um, the name sort of relates back to like how we used to think of like the area beyond a port, right? So if we think about, maybe I'll just pull up this image really quick because it's relevant for this. If you think about like the idea of like flyover country in the United States, like that area between the coasts and like everything in the middle, people kind of forget about. I mean, like Minnesota kind of gets tied into that group sometimes too. But I think a lot about like those objects that kind of connect it. And the idea of a hinterland is like everything kind of beyond the port, right? And like kind of going into the etymology of that, like I found it really, really strong in how it like connected rural communities. So in working in this project, I was really wondering like, okay, what is the hinterland that I'm occupying here? What kind of connects it? So we have the container obviously as an object that does this. We also have heavy industry, right? Like this is the kind of part of the country where they're going to set up oil refinement. So this is from a couple towns over in Billings, Montana, where you're going to have 3 or 4 refineries because that's the main economy of that town and becomes the backbone of it. So I got really curious into like, okay, what if this is what's providing the jobs for people and the stability? What does that look like, and how do we interact and live with places like this? To thinking about like what gets left over, right now, if you were to come to Bozeman, Montana, this is sort of what it's going to look like. There's going to be some condos, some new construction going on over where they condemned like a business that maybe been there for 30 years. And you're going to see a lot of cranes and a lot of that construction of trying to create this new vision of big sky country. Yet, if you were to go to one of those heavy extraction towns, you're going to find, one of the largest kind of brick structures in Northern America from Anaconda, Montana, where they did all the smelting for copper in the United States for a good chunk of the 20th century. And you're going to have these kind of leftovers mixing at the same time as we're trying to like transform this kind of formerly pretty agrarian place. So this image is part of the Butte Area Superfund site. It's simply a creek that goes where they used to store a lot of slag and tailings. When I first got here, I got really kind of fascinated with like, oh, it must just be like a lava flow, right? Like it has that same kind of structure. Maybe they had to carve a creek through it or something like that. And then I was having lunch, chatting with some people. They were like, oh yeah, no, that's all slag. And like going back to the days I was like pouring metal in my sculpture class, I was like, that's just like the top skin that's oxidized, and I've never seen that like accumulate more than like the palm of my hand. And now there's like this giant tunnel created with that. So like the scale of like what was left behind is like in that kind of agrarian extractive kind of culture really fascinated me. So much of this work was trying to understand its cultural identity through the kind of objects that have been left behind and the kind of new things being constructed. So now, like you go around, you see a lot of those signifiers for that construction, the rezoning. So something as simple as like a fence that, growing up on a military base, you're surrounded by totally makes sense. You're often, especially overseas, trying to designate what's, US government property, what is, the local culture in Okinawa. And like there's this physical barrier between those. So finding so many of these in this part of the country, I found really surprising because it wasn't, we're not in this infrastructure of safety and like separating military from, the domestic space around it. It's like, people are here to ski and like farm. And then, so what's the purpose of like a fence such as this? And for me, a lot of it is just really trying to like connect those dots. So now you're getting a lot more of those like kind of luxury condos and apartments and trying to like find the kind of union between that architecture and the sawmill a town over and like kind of connecting those two things together. And often as I'm doing this, like I think about photographs often and what we put them next to. So I kind of pull up some like kind of mock-ups of things I've played around with where I'm literally trying to like layer images next to each other on a wall to kind of convey that meaning of what it's like to walk through the space, right? So you'd have this larger image with this kind of architectural design where we're like putting boards into it so it picks up that wood grain texture next to the actual like stacks of them at a sawmill that go into these apartments, and then the kind of wraps that get stuck in trees that cover those pallets, and really trying to like look at this in the way you might think of like collage or installation in that way, where I have these multiple nodes about what's happening culturally in the economy in a town and how can I bring those back together. And kind of give you one kind of more example with that. It's from a recent show I was in that just opened a couple weeks ago. And you can sort of see like how I play with this in a physical space. So to give you that idea of walking through the land, I'm going to take that smelting tower and this mountain of slag that's sitting in front of it that they're in the process of mediating by recovering with topsoil, and essentially lay out this kind of photo text behind that image. So when you put the two together, you can see the dust that's blowing over where they've already mediated with like the essential like cause on top of it. So and the rest of the work really kind of bounces back and forth between that. So things as simple as like the modes of transport on an interstate system, because we're not so tied to the railway anymore, at least in terms of like our quotidian landscape. When you go through Montana, it's often like the semi trucks that you think of passing on I-90, or the kind of detritus that happens between those. So it's kind of like a quick kind of overview of what I'm like thinking about with it. I think I've been working on this project for almost like 7 years now, and I might pop out of this for a second.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of images I'm kind of going through, and like the whole wall kind of behind my computer here is just contact sheets, and like looking at those connecting points between them and how those explain that narrative a little bit of that transition from agrarian to our kind of current economy that's leaning more towards tourism, thinking of nature as this beautiful aesthetic resource we should have, but we're now doing that over top of like open pit mining that like faces the highway. And kind of how does that change our identity culturally here?
I was interviewing someone previously before, and they were doing work like this, and they were doing a lot of our human interaction with the landscape itself. And Big Sky Country is it's what they call it out there in Montana. It's just absolutely gorgeous. You could literally take a beautiful photo almost everywhere you walk. And what's interesting about what
Yeah.
you're doing is that you're choosing to focus on something else. And when you choose to focus on our human impact on land, uh, sometimes that can have, when I've seen in the past, it kind of has an effect on you. Has that had an effect on you? Has it changed your opinion on certain things, and if it has, what are they?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I feel like when you work in this vein, whether it be like through landscape or even through portraiture or working with communities that have been impacted by superfund sites, like it's really easy to kind of lose hope, right? Of like, oh yeah, we're gonna be fine. I mean, gosh,
You call it
yeah.
super fund site?
Yeah, so
Is that what you call it?
yeah, yeah. So it's called a superfund site, essentially meaning that like irreparable damage has happened to an area's ecology that like no amount of money can fix it. It's sort of like the general idea. So, like if you can imagine where there's been a huge oil spill, right? Like on a beach or something,
Ah,
like at a certain point, if it enters the water table, there's not a lot we can do. Like that's there now, especially when we start thinking about longer time cycles, like thinking of like how our culture exists on a geologic time scale, suddenly like, oh, we had a refinery here. What do
yeah.
we put there now? Well, you can't put any buildings on top because the off gassing is going to like basically give people migraines, cause cancers in the long term. So, and I think it started off as like kind of a sarcastic comment in the 70s or 80s, but someone with the EPA was like, oh, we'll put a golf course there. And now, if you drive through the American West, you can almost find where they've done either like oil or copper smelting or like oil and gas refinement because there'll just be this golf course in this weird part of town. And you're like, why is that there? You know, I mean, you'll find it in Anaconda, Casper, I think even Cheyenne. Like, pretty, I mean, it's hard to go to town without being like, oh, that's where they used to do this. Or maybe they were coating like telephone pole lines that had like a sludge that had arsenic and some other heavy kind of chemicals in them. So often they'll refer to those as a superfund just because trying to mediate it becomes near impossible. So, but there is growth in that area. I think the one in Anaconda, they're in the process of at least trying to isolate it so that dust isn't blowing into town. It's not getting into other aspects of the water. But it's definitely a volatile idea we have to kind of deal with when we start thinking about, okay, 10,000 years from now, what's going to happen here? And how is that going to affect the peoples and animals and ecology? Like I was a part of this kind of global art intervention a couple years ago called Extraction Art at the Edge of the Abyss that essentially tried to tackle that a little bit. So a bunch of artists from around the world got together to make work, share works, from photography to painting to poetry and installations and films, all kind of sparked by this forecast of when the Berkeley pit, which essentially it's a Superfund site in Butte, Montana, where they had a almost mile deep open pit mine that they shut the pumps off when the original company, went bankrupt. So it's slowly filled with water. But the pH of that water is around 2, and it's full of all kinds of heavy metals they used to be extracting. And it was a slowly approaching the water table. So the idea was like 2021 when it was forecasted to hit the water table without mediation. They've since added some mediation to kind of keep it below that threshold, but artists from around the world got together to kind of like try to bring attention and raise awareness to this and really kind of use that community kind of crowd idea of like, if we're all thinking about this right now, maybe we can start thinking about those long-term ramifications into the future a little bit better.
That's fascinating. Actually, it's you know, I've been looking at a lot of this kind of work, and I'm always curious about. And I was pointing at it with my previous question, and I'm curious about the effects on you. How have you changed
Yeah.
your mind? How has it affected you looking at this kind of stuff?
It's caused me to censor a little bit of what I would normally like show or photograph in some ways. Like I remember a couple of years ago, I was sitting down showing someone some photographs and we were talking and like they kind of had a similar question. They're like, how are you doing with this? And like they could kind of like tell like, there's a kind of depression that you get in if you think about these things too much. And I was definitely like
Easily.
in feeling that burden. And and now, like often when I'm thinking about a site that I want to photograph, I factor that in. So I'm getting ready to fly down to Tennessee to photograph this old ammunition depot that's been converted into a public park. And my interest in that kind of comes from looking at, okay, where have we actually mediated and the public can use it again? And this is safe for the local ecology. because like there's only so many times you can like kind of look at the edge of the abyss, right? Before you're going to go crazy. So it's like you kind of have to look back to like, okay, where are the good examples of
Yeah.
where we've done this right? And I just kind of stumbled upon one down in just outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee. So I was going to kind of spend some time there, just like kind of reflecting. And I've already kind of done some research online. I've visited the site once and walked around and was like, this feels so much like every military base I grew up on. Yet I'm not afraid of like what's in the soil, which is amazing. So often,
Yeah.
like you find a site like that, and they're like, okay, well, mercury, if you see any water, don't walk into it because it rises, right? So you're going to be getting exposed to that, especially with like ammunition depots. There's so many heavy metals that like end up there. So it's nice to kind
Yeah.
of find that one hopeful moment and kind of immerse in that, especially to kind of have that back and forth between kind of the brutal reality of when it goes wrong versus like, no, there is some ways that we can like think about this in a longer term way that doesn't impact us for that many future generations.
So you found yourself trying to find a balance to see if there's some kind of other type of hope and finding
Yeah.
evidence for that.
Oh yeah, just like trying to find hope. I think as an artist is really important. Otherwise, it's really easy to kind of just get like too isolated.
It's a tough subject. When you realize what big business can do, especially to a place, especially out there in Montana where people don't think anyone is looking, and so it's interesting for you to kind of take that moment to look to provide that perspective and to provide it for everyone. I'm curious what the reception is like when you show this kind of work.
Yeah, it's kind of hot and cold. Like there's people who I think engage with this politically pretty frequently. So like for them, and I find that we have really fruitful conversations around the work. Where they're like, "Oh yeah, I know this area," and they're like honestly like filling in like details I didn't quite know about. Like, "Oh, did you know that they're planning to do this there, and this other company is going to come in," or little kind of tidbits like that. But other times I'll have folks who are just like, "Well, this is what made us like Montana, or like made us like you know this whatever insert Western town name," and like it's so ingrained into the cultural identity. I think looking back on it with any kind of critique feels pretty volatile to them. Like I had a chat just a couple days ago with a woman from an area that I had photographed recently, like looking at an image from it, and it was hard for her to feel like there was trust between us because she's seeing this as I'm criticizing like your cultural identity in this negative light. Yet I think that there's like bridges between that we can kind of agree on, right? Like, and I'll actually pull up another image here really quick. Um, because I
Wow,
find
that
like
is a
it interesting
great
who
contrast.
uh, pull this up here.
Wow.
So
Okay,
like
here.
when I'm photographing sites like this, often people are like, "Oh, well, you're doing this for political reasons, right? You're photographing a refinery because like refineries are bad." And really, like I found them beautiful before I was a photographer. There's something gorgeous about light at night like this. And I think that's like a bridge that even if you're very pro energy, pro oil extraction, like we can kind of bond over how beautiful these places are at night and like begin a bridge and dialogue, even though I might want to see less oil being used and like kind of switch over to other more clean energies. There is like common ground here. And when I was in undergrad, I was out photographing with a visiting artist who's a South Korean photographer, Taewon Jang, and he did a whole book called Stained Ground, where he's photographing different industrial sites throughout the world, often at night with this kind of glow and atmosphere. Yet when we went out to Sinclair, Wyoming, we like pulled off just on the edge of like the public property outside of one of these refineries. And within like 10, 15 minutes, we had the Sinclair PD, the Highway Patrol, the Sheriff's Department, all on us. I think there was like 13 guys in total that responded to us just having a camera set up like on the edge of the property line. And they were just telling us, oh, the company doesn't want you here. You need to leave. And we're like, well, it's public property. Legally, do we have to leave? And they're like, well, legally you don't, but the company doesn't want you here. Like, and they, that kind of rhetoric. and they all end up kind of leaving. We stay on the edge of the property line to kind of make these long exposures at night. And eventually the head of security pops out like on this golf cart, and he's just telling us like, yeah, this is why I love the night shift. Isn't it just beautiful? And I'm like, we just go through all of this with the law enforcement thinking that we're here to do something that like puts their town at risk. And then here's the person who's in charge of security who kind of gets why we're there at night. So for me, I find like trying to promote those dialogues really beneficial.
Wow, you that is, I was in a conversation with another artist. It's one of our first episodes on this podcast, and she was in a very small town in Iceland, and she has a boat, these big cruise lines that come in, and they have a population of 400 people, and they drop off 5,000 people in this town, and these people are exploring this place, and the kind of traction and the kind of interaction that comes from that many people showing up on such a regular basis can have an effect on the landscape, the town itself. And she was commenting on that. And she was commenting on that
Yeah, I can.
experience and its effects on nature and so on, our effects on nature. And when she was producing the body of work, and she had kind of she was doing a documentary series on it. She had a experience where it was a mixed bag. Some people were like, well, we need that. We don't have the same industry. We don't have fishing anymore. So we need like tourism to come in and kind of help with the economy here. And so you have this strange thing that's happening where you have like the economy of what's actually happening, but then our actual impacts on that. How does that affect you? Like, do you feel torn? Do you see both sides here as far as this is providing dinner for families, but at the exact same time, are we creating some kind of issue that's irreversible to the landscape? How do you work on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's such a complex problem, right? Like, you obviously need people coming and going. I feel like I might know whose work you're talking about too, because it's an issue that we deal with in
Jessica
Bozeman.
Hour.
So
Yeah.
it's so close to home.
Jessica
Oh yeah,
Hour.
Jessica
Yeah,
Hour.
that's
Yeah,
her name.
absolutely. Yeah, it's just
Yeah,
such a
yeah, yeah.
fantastic
She's
photographer.
wonderful. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah,
yeah,
she is. She does
but
large
like
format like you.
in Bozeman.
Yes.
Oh, I never realized that. I need to do a deeper dive into her
Yeah.
work. I should watch the episode. But yeah, in Bozeman, it's something that we deal with a lot, right? Like as we're transformed our economy maybe quicker than some of the other towns near us. Like we have the Yellowstone Club, which brings in a lot of tourism, a lot of spillover from the town of Big Sky. So in Bozeman, you have so many businesses that are geared towards like marketing to people that live in the Yellowstone Club or those kind of luxury economies that they want when they're visiting. That idea of coming to Big Sky country to ski. And then by the summer, everything switches gears to Yellowstone. Because while we're not like the closest town, we are one of the more major airports outside of Jackson Hole. So we get so many people that come here just to go see that. Like we're kind of feeling that same pressure of like, what's the right balance? Like how much of this can the infrastructure of the city and people support before the people that actually live here are forced out, and then those who are coming here for vacation are all that are left. And I think when you're looking at like a town that is so reliant on extraction industries, having that same conversation, they're like, at what point do we switch from oil and gas to wind turbines and solar? Because, and I've had a lot of friends growing up in Wyoming who like are on both sides of that, where they're like, no, I come from like an oil family, like even just using a wind turbine or like a solar charger, they feel like they're betraying like their bloodline or something. Yet I've had friends who like left the oil and gas industry to go work in the wind farms because they're like, yeah, it pays better. I can like buy a house now, and I don't like come home dirty and smelly, full of like all of the stuff I've been exposed to every day. I just have to get over my fear of heights to like climb a tower, which has been an interesting one because there is this very blue collar conversation there that often gets put to the side, I think sometimes. And I think that's where that combative alienation happens, is like someone's real concerns about how they're going to pay their mortgage, be able to raise a family, educate their family, have health care, often are like the primary things they're trying to decide. So like everyone cares when a train derailment happens and suddenly the Yellowstone River is like full of toxic chemicals for a little while. And they say you can't eat the fish anymore. Often that means someone who's living off of the fish they catch isn't eating protein for a little while. So often like that's how dire it is for some of the people in these communities. So it's really, I think, easy to have this conversation above them about, well, we have to have this or that. And often it's so much more nuanced than that.
I think exploring that nuance is something that I wasn't aware of, and I loved I loved your response to that, because you actually gave me that kind of balanced kind of perspective. Like, you have those people that are very much activist, and they want to kind of change the way we do things, but then you have those people that are trying to survive, and I think that's just very fascinating. And I find myself sometimes kind of thinking about every aspect of this, and it doesn't seem like there's a really easy answer. It's just that we need to all kind of come together and figure out proper solutions that solve all the problems,
Yeah.
And but at the exact same time, I think the work itself calls attention to it, where it could easily get lost. When you live in those mining towns and you live in those, I lived in Texas. You just get used to the refinery. They almost start blending
Yeah.
in. You forget they're there. You forget that they're alien.
Yeah.
And to
Yeah.
bring them back out and make it very apparent that this is not natural. It's not a part of it, and that one day we're going to have to switch it back. And depending on what that impact is it's hard to fathom. But I think that the work is really, really powerful.